5 minutes of meditation. So we can start just with a couple minutes of mindfulness. So bring our attention to the breath. As we breathe in, we can be aware of the present moment sensations of breathing in. As we breathe out, we can be aware of the present moment sensations of breathing out. And when thoughts arise, just notice them and gently bring our attention back to the breath. And then while we're still in a kind of meditative mode, just spend a few minutes cultivating our motivation, bodhicitta, grounded in love and compassion. Maybe we'll just start that part just by thinking about how everyone is, like we just pause right now and contemplate, right, how all beings are the same as me in wanting to be happy and in wanting to not suffer. So I think of like my I think of an example of like somebody I'm close to, and then I can easily see, right, that person wants to be happy just as deeply as I do, wants to avoid pain and suffering exactly as much as I do. And then I can see even that, like that. So that's true of people close to me, but it's even true of like the tiniest ant. If you put sugar down, the ant will come, take it. So you can see it's looking for something that it wants, just like people do. If you pound the table near it, or it'll run away, just like people, right? It's trying to preserve its life. Even those I don't like, it's same, right? They were trying to be happy. They follow maybe a different idea of what would make them happy than I do, but just like me, they want to be happy and not suffer. So humans are like that, but non-humans are like that also. Everyone on this call is the same in that way. Wanting to be happy, comfortable, and well, not wanting to be sick or in pain or suffering. In that way, we're all the same. So this is like the reality, actually, of our interpersonal situation. But then if I don't, then we can also see, if we contemplate, that if I only or mainly focus on my own well-being to the exclusion of others, then I actually make more problems for myself and others. The more self-centered I am, actually the more fearful of others, the more insecure, the more agitated. We can actually see how like exaggerated self-centeredness, or self-referential thoughts, self-referential thinking, self-referential ruminations lead to problems in families, problems between countries, so many different kinds of, like, all of my anger comes from that. Pride, jealousy, hatred, fears. From Buddhist perspective, all the actions that lead to the sufferings of the lower realms come from that kind of approach. They become overly focused on the self that I grasp at, and then I give rise to like different mental afflictions, and that's the cause of like bad rebirths. So in this life, it's the cause of mental suffering, interpersonal suffering, conflicts. If we look at like the environmental problems we're facing, they come from that. If we look at, the extent of the pandemic, it comes from that. If you look at the tensions between countries, it comes from that. But even the tensions in a family come from that. And then if you contrast that, right, to love that cherishes it and sees others as precious, the moment you start to feel that, there's some feeling of happiness or peace in your mind and also interpersonally. So love, cherishing others, adoring others, caring deeply for others is the cause of my own well-being and others' well-being. When there's when the main experience in a home is love, then that home is peaceful, has room for joy. When there's love in a community, then that community is peaceful, and the people in it are happier. So you could see that, right? The extent of the mental afflictions in a person or in a family or even in a country or in the world. The more mental afflictions, the less happiness. The more loving kindness, the more room for happiness. So then the next step is seeing that, right? I commit myself to love. I commit myself to compassion. The purpose of my life, the purpose of this day, the purpose of this class, right, of being here together, is just that, is love, is compassion, is the wish, to bring happiness, freedom from suffering to others, which also, by the way, like as a side effect, creates more happiness for myself too, because we're interdependent, because my well-being depends on others' well-being, others' well-being depends upon my good heart. And so I commit myself to the good heart. The ultimate expression of that good heart is bodhicitta, the wish to become a fully enlightened Buddha for the welfare of others. So with that in our hearts, then we can just recite the verse of refuge and bodhicitta. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merits of giving and the other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Well, then we can switch into a more interactive mode now. And I'll stop the screen share in a second. I'll bring up a few others as we go along, but I just wanted to share this to begin with. So this is a close-up of, this seems to be the most, I guess they say this tanka of Shar Keldan Gyatso was painted, I think, during his lifetime. So I guess it's a realistic depiction of him. He's the poet we're going to talk about. So I just thought to start by kind of giving this image of him. Obviously you can see he's a monk wearing a yellow pandit's hat. So maybe I'll stop that for now, and then I'll say a little bit about him. But I wanted you to see him before I kind of just talk about him. Let's see, okay. And it's kind of fun to get to talk about Shar Keldan Gyatso. I'll share, first of all, I had never, it's funny, like in Tibet, he's a very well-known Lama person. I had never heard of him initially, and then it was actually Gyumed Khensur Rinpoche who would often quote, he would often like, it was the first time I ever heard him quote, it was that he was teaching at my house, I remember, and he just like, his face lit up. He said, and then, Shar Keldan Gyatso says, and he kind of lit up, and afterwards I said, who's that? I never, like, I always like to know, like, these kind of, like, I was like, who's that? And he was like, he looked at me like, you don't know Shar Keldan Gyatso, which made me kind of, I was like, and then I realized not much of his, at that time, there's been more now, and there was a little, but not a lot of his works had been in English yet, but they've been translating them now into English. And actually, I'll just share this. What Khensur Rinpoche said was, I think, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but essentially he said, well, he's like the Gelugpa Milarepa, which was a kind of sweet description. And actually, well, anyway, I'll share it later. But that was his initial answer. Maybe I'll just I'll give a little context by sharing something about who Shar Keldan Gyatso was, and then we'll go into some of his poetry, which is really delightful. He's a wonderful, wonderful person. You can tell from his poetry. But first of all, so he lived from 1606 to 1677, and he was born in Amdo, which is the same part of Tibet where before him Tsongkhapa was born in Amdo, and long after him, the current Dalai Lama was born in Amdo. So it's the part of Tibet, that part of Tibet. And this is a little significant. During his lifetime, so Amdo is kind of there's central Tibet, and then Amdo is north and a bit east. And so so it's closer to Mongolia. And during his lifetime, Amdo was occupied by the Mongol armies. So he was kind of, so you can imagine, I mean, Tibet was still Tibet, but it was an occupied territory. And in some of his poems, which I don't think I'll read any of those, but in some of his poems, he kind of laments the situation. It's not great to be living in an occupied country. But those were the circumstances. And, Tibetans then throughout history were kind of, there was always this dynamic, right, because the Mongol armies were quite powerful. And so there were alliances and so on. But Keldan Gyatso lived during a time, he lived during the time when Tibet became unified, for the first time in centuries. It became unified under the Great Fifth Dalai Lama, and he met the Great Fifth Dalai Lama in his lifetime. So he lived in a kind of politically important time. When he was born, Tibet was occupied, and there were different Mongol armies in different parts of Tibet, and there actually, for centuries at that point, also like, there had been conflicts between the Tibetans, because Tibet wasn't unified. So there would be like a region of Tibet that was mainly ruled by a certain king, and he was allied with the Kagu, and then another area was ruled by another king, and he was associated with the Gelugpas, another area where the Sakyas were. And so there were these kind of sectarian conflicts and regional conflicts. And it was during his lifetime that that Tibet became unified because of an alliance, really. That the Great Fifth Dalai Lama was supported by the strongest of the Mongol leaders and sort of unified the country. And it's strange because, if you think about it, that was the time when the Dalai Lama tradition unified Tibet as one, under the Dalai Lama's sort of Ganden Podrang government. And that ended in our lifetime. The current Dalai Lama, the Great Fifth Dalai Lama started that, and the current Dalai Lama ended that. That no longer exists, and it was his decision, right? I often think about that because it's rare that somebody intentionally gives away power, but the Dalai Lamas that did. Anyway, I went off on a tangent, but it is worth thinking about. But okay, so Shar Keldan Gyatso was born in the early 1600s, and then this part I just thought to share a little bit about his life because it's interesting. So he had an older half brother named Chopra Rinpoche, who kind of took responsibility for him. And I'll just share this when so his older brother, shared, I'm not sure if he shared the mom or the dad, but they had one parent in common. And when I think about that, when I was reading about that, of course, I couldn't help it. I thought of Geshe Dargi and Tashi, because they have the same relationship, isn't it? They're half brothers also. And the older brother, and Geshe Dargi kind of told me about, he was like, oh, he had two younger brothers, right? Two younger half brothers. And he said, well, one of them should become a monk and study with Khensur Rinpoche. And he went and kind of talked to his dad. And that's, I guess my point is like, that's something that happens in Tibetan culture. And so it happened for Shar Keldan Gyatso. His older half brother came and said, hey, he looks like somebody who, just like Geshe Dargi did for Tashi, Chopra Rinpoche came to the parent and said, hey, he looks like he'd make a good monk. Why don't you let me take him to the monastery and get him an education, right? Because otherwise, actually, as was the case quite recently, otherwise, Shar Keldan Gyatso wouldn't have gotten an education, right? So his older half-brother thought, he looks bright, he looks like this kid who has merit and intelligence, and let me help him get an education. So so the parents agreed, and they sent him with his much older brother to get educated. And I'll just share Chopra Rinpoche, who was this older brother, was an interesting figure. He was also, he had studied in the Gelugpa tradition, and had been recognized strangely, and this is interesting because it was very important because it affects Shar Keldan Gyatso's life a lot. Remember I just mentioned, that's why I mentioned it, that during this time period, there were these inter-regional and also really sectarian conflicts. And one of the main conflicts was between Gelugpas and Kagus. They didn't get along back then. And they would have sometimes, their two sides would have like wars and things like that. And so one thing that was quite significant, though, is that Chopra Rinpoche was recognized as a reincarnation of Milarepa. So he was a Gelugpa monk who was recognized as the reincarnation of the founder of the Kagu tradition. And so there was a natural tendency for Chopra Rinpoche and Shar Keldan Gyatso to be non-sectarian then. Or was to not, they praised often, and Shar Keldan Gyatso has numerous poems, I'll say, praising the Kagu tradition and praising the early masters of the Kagu tradition, which was a radical thing for a Gelugpa monk to do at the time. So that's kind of cool, actually. He was kind of non-sectarian when it wasn't so cool to be non-sectarian. And also both of them followed Milarepa's example in their lives, as we'll talk about. And as Khensur Rinpoche pointed out when he said he's the Gelugpa of Milarepa or something. But so Chopra Rinpoche was kind of a yogi. He had gotten educated, but he mainly spent his time in like mountains doing retreat. And Shar Keldan Gyatso clearly, his older brother was his guru, was his teacher, so he looked up to him that way. But he also you get the sense that he idolized Chopra Rinpoche as this yogi who was like living in the mountains and lived this sort of lifestyle of sort of going off to caves and meditating. And you get the sense that Shar Keldan Gyatso wanted to follow in his brother's footsteps. But when he was 11, his brother said, well, you've got to study. And so his brother said, I'm going to take you to central Tibet, which was quite a long journey at that time, right? On foot. I want to take you to central Tibet so you can get an education. He had been teaching up to that point, but he wanted him to get like a formal education, right? So he took him to Ganden Monastery, which was the monastery that had been founded by Tsongkhapa himself. So at the age of 11, Shar Keldan Gyatso enrolled, you could say, in a study program at Ganden. And he stayed there for about a decade, studying intensively. And and meanwhile, you could imagine, right, that Chopra Rinpoche kind of stayed there for a little while to acclimate him, and then he went back off to his mountain retreats until he left his brother to study for a while. And so there he studied for about a decade intensively, and had many different teachers. But I want to mention one teacher who became especially important in his life, and who is one of the towering figures in the Gelugpa tradition and Tibetan tradition, which was the first Panchalama, Losang Chogi Gyaltsen. And most, if you go regularly to DNKL, then you're familiar with the first Panchalama, because he's the author of, for example, the Lama Chopa, the Guru Puja that's done regular every, at least twice a month, or some people do it every day, whatever. He composed that. He also composed the main Gelugpa commentary on Mahamudra. He composed many, many, many different texts that are studied in Gelugpa, places. He studied many sadhanas that are done regularly. So he was this kind of, and in particular, he kind of was this figure who combined, well, first of all, he was the teacher of the 4th Dalai Lama, the 5th Dalai Lama. I mean, he was and really the Panchen Lama tradition got its name because of him. He was the first Panchen Lama, and then the Panchen Lamas, because of his reputation, really, that's why they became the second most important Lama in Tibetan history, after the Dalai Lamas come throughout from that time forward. But anyway, so the Panchalama was a kind of, actually, I'll share one other thing about the Panchalama. It's interesting, right? He was the teacher, he was the main guru of the great 5th Dalai Lama who unified Tibet. But he was also the main teacher of the, I don't know if it was the first, but of the Kalka Jetsun Dampa who unified Mongolia under one Lama. And he was the main Lama of a teacher, I can't remember his name now, who kind of helped unify Bhutan. So he was this kind of figure who was like, who kind of helped unify nations, actually, by mentoring great prodigies. So he was an unusual kind of teacher. And Shar Keldan Gyatso kind of found him very, very inspiring. And also he kind of furthered, another thing that I think made him feel connected was that Shar Keldan Gyatso's brother, Chopra Rinpoche, was practicing Mahamudra, right? Which was mainly a Kagu practice, right? Which again would have been unusual for a Gelugpa monk. But then the first Panchen Lama, Losang Chogi Gyaltsen, wrote a Mahamudra commentary from a Gelugpa perspective, the first one that was popular. And so he got to study Mahamudra, with him, which was going to become one of his main practices. So anyway, so the Panchen Lama became one of his role models, and I'm going to say a little more about that as we go along. But and he took full ordination. Actually, this is interesting. Also, he took full ordination in the Jokang. The Jokang is the most precious temple in central Tibet, where there's a famous statue there of the Buddha that was brought to Tibet during the imperial period, and I think it's where the Dalai Lama took ordination, and Shar Keldan Gyatso took ordination there from the Panchen Lama, his full ordination. And a little while after taking full ordination, he went back to Amdo. He went back to, so he was like, okay, he had finished his sort of core studies, and he thought, I want to go do a retreat. I want to go be a yogi. And so actually, in this part of his life, he kind of reminds me a little bit of Khensur Rinpoche again. So he goes back to Amdo and, to go see his brother and say, I'm ready now. I did my studies. I want to go on a retreat. And so he goes to Chopra Rinpoche and says that, right? And Chopra Rinpoche says, well, you just finished your studies. Now you should teach. People, there are so many students here in Amdo who need a teacher, need good teachings. And why don't you found some hermitages and also found, teach at the monastery. And you get the sense that Shar Keldan Gyatso is like, but it'd be really great to do a retreat. And his teacher is saying like, yes, that's good. But first teach. And so he kind of went and started teaching, and he founded a few different hermitages, and he taught at some of the major monasteries. And he founded a monastery. And he kept you get the sense during this period of his life, he kept going back to Chopra Rinpoche and saying, okay, I founded that place and I taught for a year. Can I go on a retreat now? And Chopra Rinpoche would say like, well, like do a month retreat and then go back and teach more, that kind of thing. And so for a number of years, that was sort of Shar Keldan Gyatso's life pattern, was he would go do these sort of shorter retreats and then teach, and then do another short retreat and teach. But he wanted to go off and just wander, so that was, he did that for a number of years. And then when he was around 30, he started doing longer retreats. He finally felt like it was, he just sort of, I guess, it wasn't really clear to me from I'm not sure if his brother had passed away by then, and so he couldn't tell him not to, or not. It's not really clear to me exactly what happened, I don't recall, but around then he started just, and he calls himself a wanderer. And then other people started to call him, there's a Tibetan term, drupchen, which means great meditator, great yogi, and everybody started to recognize him as that kind of figure. So during those years, he would mostly do retreat, but occasionally he would teach. And then he was so popular that other people started becoming yogis and sort of, following him. meditating like he was. So he had students in the monastery, but he also had students who would just sort of like find their own cave, I guess you would say. And this is interesting. He actually, I found it as I was looking in his biography, there are a couple biographies that say this, that actually in Amdo then there was a tradition began, which was unique, I think, to Amdo, as far as I can tell, called the Richopa, which in Tibetan apparently means those of the wilderness. And so it was like a tradition of his students who became like wilderness people, who were kind of yogis, in other words. And they became like so he kind of started a tradition there of these kind of wandering meditative yogis. So one of the ways he was like Milarepa, of course, is that he was this yogi who meditated a lot in caves and huts and retreat hermitages. But another way that he was like Milarepa, which I want to now mention because it's the transition into the main topic, is also like Milarepa, he would sing spontaneous songs of realization and teaching. And I just wanted to say a little bit about it because I was reading about that. I'm no expert on it, but I was reading some about it. And it's interesting, like, because, India had, of course, India was a high culture, right? India was like this. And India has always been, before, just reading about that, like, India is this amazing culture, right, that had metrics and complex ideas of poetry. It had complex ideas of philosophy. I'm teaching a class in a Gyumed Khensur Center on tennis, and I was like amazed to read, like, 400 years before the Greeks came up with the theory of atoms, it was like, India had atomic theory, the theory that matter is made up of atoms. No other culture had come up with even the idea of that. And they were sort of debating, are there atoms, or, they were debating, are there atoms or are there subatomic particles, and are atoms solid or do they have parts? They were sort of debating these kind of things, right? So India is this very high culture, right? Tibet was less so, early on, that was that, early in history. But so Tibet adopted, in one way, when Tibet brought Buddhism, of course, it brought also India's ideas of poetics, right, and metrics. And so in Tibet, there was kind of native musical traditions, like any culture has, right, that were kind of connected to ancient Tibet. And then there were like educated Tibetans who were studying Indian metrics, and they would study the classical Indian poetry. And then there were the Indian poems they're called the Dohas, which were like these Indian poems of realization that great yogis in India had written. And it was really apparently, it was around Milarepa's time that Milarepa was kind of a seminal figure, a key figure in developing this new tradition that was uniquely Tibetan. So some Tibetans were writing Indian style poetry, and Sakya Pandita was famous for that, right? The great Sakya scholar. He wrote kind of, he was a master of classical Indian metrics and so on. He would write poems more like that. Whereas Milarepa kind of just sang these spontaneous songs that were more in the style of Tibetan music, but combined some elements of the Dohas, of these songs of realization from India, because he held that lineage coming from Tilopa and Naropa. So he kind of innovated this new form of Buddhist poetry, really, Milarepa did, which was much more earthy, right? If you read Milarepa's songs, he sometimes talks about, his butt being sore from sitting in a cave and things like that. He wasn't using always these kind of classical images of peacocks and, whatever, and so on. Literally, he would write things like that. And so he so from his time on, there was this tradition of these kind of spontaneous songs of realization that also the common people of Tibet loved, and would memorize and sing, and they would become part of plays that would then be done, in the village and so on. And people might just sing them as they were working out in the field, things like that. And then lamas would kind of memorize them and teach them, and they became a certain kind of a uniquely Tibetan poetic expression. So the reason why I mention all of that is Shar Keldan Gyatso came to write many, many such songs, and his songs became very popular. And there's a woman named Victoria Sujata who wrote a couple books. Most of the, actually I'll say that there are 3 books. This one by Thupten Jinpa has just a couple of his poems called Songs of Spiritual Experience, I think. But Victoria Sujata is really a scholar of, she wrote 2, and one is called Journey to Distant Groves, and the other one's called Tibetan Songs of Realization, all of which are just her looking at at Shar Keldan Gyatso. They're all just Shar Keldan Gyatsos. life and poetry. And I was going to say, and one thing she's a music scholar as well as a Tibetan scholar. And one thing she points out is they're still sung. Here we are, like right? How many centuries later? More, more than 4 centuries later. And she went to the region of Amdo that he's from, and people are still singing his songs. And she recorded some of them, and she describes the metrics. She's a musician, so she knows how to do that. So what a thing, that he wrote these, he not even wrote, he kind of sang these songs of realization from his inner experience. And I guess, apparently if you go to Amdo, you can still hear people singing his songs using his rhythms, apparently. They were written in a certain rhythm and they still sing them the same, roughly the same. Obviously, they may have changed over the centuries, but they sing them, using a certain rhythms that are regional. And I guess, and they pick up the kind of tunes of that region of Tibet musically. It seems very delightful, doesn't it? And the idea that somebody would sing spontaneous songs from their inner experience and they would sort of use those as a teaching method. So that's it. And maybe I'll now, let's see if I can do it. Maybe I'll just share one more image if I can figure out how to. Oh, there, I'll share this one. Let's see if I can do it just for a moment. This is a much more stylized current image of Shar Keldan Gyatso. Can you see it? Is everybody? Yeah, good. And the reason why I'm sharing this one is it's a statue, it's a current, but the gesture he has, right? His right hand by his ear, and this kind of with the, is an unusual gesture that is usually statues, the vast majority of statues of Milarepa have that gesture, right? So I just wanted to share this statue, the image of this statue. It's much more recently made. The tanka I shared was, I think, from his lifetime. Whereas this statue is a more recent statue that she shares. She took this picture from Amdo. But even the iconography is making the same point. If you know Tibetan iconography and you see that, you say, wow, that's he's got the hat, it looks like a Gelugpa monk, but he's got the gesture of Milarepa. And it's what Khensur Rinpoche said, right? He's the Gelugpa Milarepa. This image is saying what Khensur Rinpoche said, essentially, right? He's got the hat and the robes of a Gelugpa monk and this text. But his right hand is in the gesture of the ear whispered lineage. Sometimes they say listening, or sometimes that symbolizes it's by his ear, so it symbolizes the ear whispered lineage. So Milarepa was famous for holding, the Kagu ear whispered lineage, and this image implies, right, that Shar Keldan Gyatso was practicing was a yogi who practiced the ear whispered lineage. Take that down now. Yeah. And so he's an interesting, even the iconography, it makes the same point Khensur Rinpoche was making, which is that's kind of the essence that captures something of the essence of who Shar Keldan Gyatso is to Tibetans, or in the Tibetan imagination and the Tibetan, sense of who he was. And actually, I'll say one last thing about that, which is also this idea of the ear whispered lineage, right? We'll just say something briefly about that, which is like, so, there's there are many ear whispered lineages in Tibetan, but another way of saying ear whispered is oral, right? It's like an oral tradition, right? That's passed from teacher to student, a practice lineage, that's sort of, and so the, Milarepa was famous for holding that, right? And from Himarpa. And in the Gelugpa tradition, it was actually Shar Keldan Gyatso's teacher is probably the most, apart from Tsongkhapa himself, it's called Tsongkhapa's ear whispered lineage, or Tsongkhapa's oral tradition. And, apart from Tsongkhapa himself, the other most important figure in that lineage is the first Panchalama, Losang Choki Gyaltsen. He's famous for having it was kept totally, secret until his time. And the first Panchalama, Losang Choki Gyaltsen, is famous for having opened up a little bit, made it a little less secret, let more people know about that it existed. I don't know if I should share that. I'll just share this. This is just a funny story. I'm just going off this very slow. One time I asked Khensur Rinpoche, I went to Khensur Rinpoche and I asked him for a teaching from the ear whispered lineage, and this just made me laugh. Khensur Rinpoche said, I don't know what you're talking about. And then I said, and I kind of looked at him and I was like he must know. And then I said, well, Rinpa Rinpoche told me about this. And then he said, oh, okay. And then I was like, oh, he's following tradition. He's like, you don't even talk about it. Or so, it's very funny. I was like, oh, it really is secret. And the first Panchalama, though, opened up some of those teachings. And so I think the assumption is that Shar Keldan Gyatso received those from the Panchalama and from maybe his teacher, Chopra Rinpoche, who was also a student of the Panchalamas, that Panchalama, the first Panchalama. And so, you know, Shar Keldan Gyatso is also considered to be like a practitioner of that, the ear whispered or the kind of oral tradition of Tsongkhapa. And in Tsongkhapa tradition, you combine, you know, the idea is that you do the formal study as Chopra Rinpoche did, and then you also, you know, receive kind of practice instructions. That's what it really means. And then you combine them in your practice in retreat, which is what he did. But okay, so that was all just out of, you know, trying to give an orientation to who he is. And then start. So what I was thinking to do is share, you know, kind of share some of his poems. And, you know, I went back and forth a bit. You know, we have time, but I went back and forth because he has many different styles of poetry, you know, and some of his most famous poems, I think, are I mean, some of them are very playful, and others are about Mahamudra and very advanced ideas of emptiness or tantra. I was like, where do you start? He has so many poems, you know. And I decided, of all the poems, I wanted to start with this one, because I think it's actually very, I think it captures something, many wonderful things about him. And so it's a poem. I don't know if that's, let's actually see if, I don't think it really has a title, but it's a poem about lice, fleas, and lice eggs. So you start to get a sense, I was saying about the informality. And so I thought, oh, it's good to start with something informal that also captures something of, I think it captures something of his personality, and it captures some of his creativity. This is not, you know, this wasn't something he derived from other sources, right? This is clearly his own, very much him. But one other thing I wanted to mention as I go into this one is one thing I also really like about this, and I'll have to put it in context. One last thing I'll say about the first Panchalama, his teacher. His teacher, the first Panchalama, wrote what's become a very famous text, which is translated into English. This is actually the translation of his. It's called The Panchalama's Debate Between Wisdom and the Reifying Habit. Actually, I'd heard about this text many times, and then I found that the first time I realized I was teaching at Dan Kale, actually, and I saw Geshe Dargy's edition of this, and I was like, it's in English, and so I went and bought it. So I have to thank Geshe Dargy for knowing that this even existed. But the first Panchalama wrote this text, and I'm mentioning it because it relates to a couple of the poems, where it's in the form of a dialogue between, that's why he says, a debate between wisdom and the reifying habit. It's a debate. It's a text, a playful text written in the form of a debate between his own wisdom debating against his own ignorance. And it's very playful. There's one section, there are many playful sections. You know, there's some where, like, actually, I think we can relate to this right now in the world. There's a section where they're fighting, essentially, they're arguing, right? And at one point, ignorance says to wisdom, why in the world do you think you're relevant to anybody? Look at the world. Nobody cares about you. Nobody cares about wisdom. Look around. Everybody's very attached. You know, everybody loves me. Nobody cares about you. Nobody ever listens to you. You know, so it's a very playful kind of poem that's a dialogue, in the form of a dialogue. And I'm mentioning that because I don't know if Shar Keldan Gyatso took his inspiration in part from his teacher, but you'll see this is also in the form of a dialogue. And so I'll read a little bit and then I'll pause. But he starts off by saying, at one time, I saw on the surface of my food and garments and so on, there were many lice calmly meandering, and many fleas floating about, and many lice eggs smiling and hanging out in a very relaxed way. Right, so that's his introduction. Then he says, and I advised them as follows. So here's him talking to so it's three, right? His three, and I'm just going to go back, right? So the lice were calmly meandering, the fleas were floating about, and the lice eggs were smiling and hanging out in a very relaxed way. It's very funny. Okay, so and then he advises them, right? So he's here, and anyway, I'll read it and you'll see. So he's talking to them and he says, listen, you lice who are roaming about, you lice who have eaten my body. Even if you are happy when you eat and drink, when I see you, what do you think? You thoughtless fleas, skilled in flight, if you are inseparable from what your body does, during youth, you were afraid of smells going "Rrr." True or not, continue eating and be clear about it. You bright, white, and smiling louse eggs, even if you are like pearls when you are looked at, when I see my contaminated garments, without thinking of my next life, I want to kill you. And so first of all, you get the right. I mean, the playfulness, right? I'm going to pause and just say, right, the playfulness of looking at the lice eggs as white like pearls is pretty funny. But here he is, kind of saying, right? You can see they've been biting him and eating, and so on, right? And I think like the Panchalama here, right? I mean, he's Shar Keldan Gyatso. He's at this point, he's not some young child. He's a learned Buddhist yogi, right? But he says, when I see my contaminated garments without thinking of my next life, I want to kill you. And I think that's a really important line in this poem, right? Because what's he doing there, actually? For the audience, he's kind of, first of all, for us as the audience, he's saying, he knows. In other words, when people see these creatures in their body, they want to kill them, right? So he's saying, and so, for us as an audience, he's, what's the word? Sharing that feeling in order to engage us, right? Because he knows we would feel that way. At the same time, right, he's also, I think, this is how I read it, so I'm just sharing my own reading, but also I think one thing that's really important is, he's also admitting to himself, right? When he says, without thinking of my next life, I want to kill you, right? He's admitting to himself, which is a modeling for us what to do, right? Is don't pretend you're somebody you're not. Face the truth of who you are and your own feelings, your own thoughts, right? Like, don't say, oh, I'm this holy person, right? He's saying when you're alone, he's alone there with these lice on him and these lice eggs and he's saying, that's my feeling. That's what comes up, right? And now I'm going to look at it. And I'm just pointing that out because I think we all, it may not be about that topic, but we all have feelings, right? That don't accord with the Dharma, right? We all have those things come up. And if Shar Keldan Gyatso can admit it and really deeply engage with those feelings, that's what we need to do also, right? We need to not like pretend we don't have them, not suppress them, right? But engage them. That's what the Panchalama does in his text with ignorance, right? He brings up his ignorance and lets it say, wisdom, you're irrelevant. Wisdom, you don't know what you're talking about. Wisdom, you're not practical, right? And then he lets wisdom answer. And part of the point here is, if wisdom can't win, then we're not going to make progress, right? So we have to, debate has to be with ourselves. Does that make sense? The ultimate debate is with yourself, and it's how you transform yourself by changing your inner dialogue, by facing your feelings and transforming them, and facing your thoughts and transforming them. And so I think that's what Shar Keldan Gyatso is doing here, right? When he says, without thinking of my next life, I want to kill you, which is great for a Buddhist monk to admit, right? So then he continues. He says, because I had said that, an aged louse gathered his friends and advised them as follows. Since I, an elderly louse, am skilled in eating and drinking, up until now, I have been happy and peaceful. You youngsters have been eating at inappropriate times. Will it now cause my death in connection with the smell? Right? So he's saying, the old louse is saying to the young lice, hey, you bit him too much. Now he's going to kill us. Be careful. Then he continues, relying on what he had said, all the young and old lice huddled and made a secret council in detail and replied unanimously to me as follows, right? So he's saying there was a council of lice. Can you imagine this? He's sitting there and on his robe, right? There was a council of lice. And so now there's going to be a section where the lice are going to respond to him. Does that make sense? And so the lice say, you old monk, who knows the karma of virtue and of sin. In previous lives, you ate others. On the strength of that, we will eat you. Now you have difficulty in replying. Above all, don't lecture us. Think about karma. Earlier, you, human being, looked at us and broke out in tears, having seen where we were hiding in secret. We didn't believe that you would kill us with a fingernail and a tooth. If you were going to kill some of us, we'll also eat you. Otherwise, we and the one patronized will be one, will need one another forever. Now, whether we eat or not, it's your call. Right? So what are they saying here? Right? So they're saying, wait a second. You know, you say you're upset with us that we're eating you. Why are we able to eat you? You know, right? They're saying, well, you ate us in a past life. Otherwise, we couldn't possibly, right? They're giving him a teaching on karma, aren't they? So they're saying, we couldn't bite you unless you had eaten us in a past life. It's your karma that's manifesting. And then they're quite playful, right? Then they say, as they say here. So on the strength of that, right? On the strength of his having eaten them in past lives, now we will eat you. Then he says, now the lice, they're debating him, right? This is debate. You know, I should remember he was at Ganden, right? So he debated. So this is actually a phrase that comes from, clearly would come from debate, right? He says, where they say, now you have difficulty replying. Don't lecture us, right? So they're saying, I think we're winning the debate here, right? That's what the lice are saying. And then they say, so think about karma, right? And then they're pointing out, right? They say, if you were to kill some of us now, we'll eat you, right? And what they're saying actually here, and then they say, otherwise, we will need each other forevermore. What they're saying there is, if you kill us now, you're creating more bad karma. What they're actually, right, they're saying, you created bad karma in relation to us in a past life by eating us. Now that karma has come to fruit and we're eating you. But if you kill us now, you're going to create a karmic link with us of violence that will go on forever, right? And they're saying it, now you're a human being. You know, this is your chance to change your karma, to change the karmic patterning, right? You know, if you were some other kind of creature, you wouldn't be able to. But they're saying you're a human being and you're a monk, you know, you're a Buddhist, whatever. You know, if you can't figure it out now, then it's going to go on forever, right? Which is a very profound teaching, isn't it, that they're giving him? And so then they end right with, you know, so consider all of that, and whether you kill us or not is your call, right? They're putting it back on him. And I'm just going to pause there and think about that, right? So do you get that? One is he's being quite playful, right? But also he's describing, right, this is how to think, right? And I want to, because it could seem, it's easy to read this and kind of go, oh, he's very bright and very playful and good with words and so on. But he's also giving a very profound teaching here, isn't he? You know, because, we could think literally of life. Like, what would you do if you got lice? Right? We're all Buddhists or interested in Buddhism, right? But what would you do if you got lice? You know, and you go, well, what is Shar Keldan Gyatso saying? You know, but then it's not just lice, right? The same thing applies. If somebody insults you, if somebody gives you a hard time, right? If your neighbor's annoying, if whatever, you know, if there's whether it's an insect, if there's an insect in your house, right? Why is it in your house? You know, like, why is it there? And what relationship are you creating with it, right? Where, you know, he's teaching us how to engage with ourselves. Does that make sense? And to admit, like, if you see an insect in your house, you think, oh, I want to get rid of this, right? And then to start this kind of process. Well, wait, why is it here? What's my relationship to it? What's the karma? And so on. You know, and again, whether it's an insect or whether it's a person you don't get along with or whatever, the same teaching would apply, wouldn't it? That he's just given. That the lice have just given. Sorry, he didn't give it. The lice did. But so then he continues. He says, "So they said, and now the fleas are going to chime in, right?" So he says, "So they said," meaning the lice, and he said, "Also the fleas unanimously said." So now, you know, the fleas want to get their word in, right? So they said, So now the fleas are talking. They say, "You listen, our watchman. We at times make ourselves soar up and at times float down. You, in this ocean of the cycle of the three realms, sometimes also soar up and sometimes float down. Don't be down here. Don't be down there. Soar on upwards. Up on the solitary peak, you'll soar in delight. The nature of your mind will soar up in the expanse of the sky. Don't threaten us, float up like us. Okay? So the fleas are giving a different teaching in a way, right? A slightly different teaching, right? They're pointing out, like, right, so he's playing on the activity of fleas, right, which they jump, right? Fleas leap and they go up and then they land somewhere, right? And so he's using that, or they're using that, I should say, right? The fleas are using their own movement, right? And so you can imagine this though, right? He's sitting there watching the fleas. Actually, imagine the scene, right? He's sitting there in his room alone and he's watching the fleas leap up, right? They're on his leg and they jump up and they land on his lower leg, whatever, or on his arm, right? And he sees them going up and down. And what he hears in his mind as he sees them doing what fleas do, right, is this, right? Where he's saying, so there's actually a double teaching here. One is that going up and down is the nature of samsara, right? In samsara, occasionally you go up, mostly you go down. Occasionally you're in the higher realms, mostly you're in the lower realms, right? That's the first point they're making. And then they're saying, right, so he says, you in this ocean of the cycle, right? You in samsara, that means, of the three realms, right? The form realm, the formless realm, and the desire realm. Sometimes soar up and sometimes float down, right? So they're saying sometimes you're in the higher realms, often in the lower realms. Then he says, they say to him, don't be down there, don't be down there, right? So they're saying, don't do something that's going to throw you to lower realms, right? Don't create bad karma that's going to make you suffer. So they're actually being kind to him, aren't they? And they say, soar on upwards, meaning practice Dharma, right? Then they say, up on the solitary peak, you'll soar in delight. So that's the symbol, right? Now they're saying, don't just go to the upper. Now the fleas are getting even more profound, right? Up till there, it's been, if you think of it in terms of Lamrim, up to this point, it's been the low scope, right? Don't fall to lower realms. Don't create bad karma to suffer. Now they say, keep going up and up, go all the way to the peaks. So they're playing on his wish, right, to meditate in the mountains, aren't they? Here he's down in, I think he's down in the monastery, and they're saying, they're playing, so they're picking up on his wish to go on retreat, and they're saying, go up to the peaks of the mountains. And then they're saying, soar in delight, meaning achieve liberation, achieve enlightenment, right? Keep going up and up and up in a way where you won't come back down at all. Very profound teaching from the fleas. And they say, and then they end with, the nature of your mind will soar up in the expanse of the sky. Don't threaten us, float up like us, right? So they're giving actually that the one line there, the nature of your mind will soar up in the expanse of the sky. That's actually a Mahamudra, isn't it? That's Mahamudra teaching, right? And meditation on the nature of mind, which is like the sky, right? So that's the idea, because Mahamudra is meditating on the ultimate nature of mind, the empty nature of the mind itself. And so what they're actually saying there is, if they're leaping upward, they're saying to him, not only, go up to the higher realms, but then go up to the mountain retreat. But finally, going to a mountain retreat is not enough, right? You need to realize the nature of your own mind, the emptiness of mind itself. And in that way, you'll go up and never come down again because you'll achieve enlightenment. Right? So now they've given at least a middle scope teaching, right? The teaching on liberation. So now remember, he started off by talking to lice, fleas, and lice eggs. So the lice eggs haven't yet gotten their say. So they have to also say something. Right? And remember, they were kind of hanging out, very mellow, smiling. So he says, so he ends that section, he says, so they said. Also the lice eggs, smiling, said this. So the lice eggs, they are already smiling. So here's what the lice eggs say. In our meditation huts, within the fabric of your clothes, our bodies are not moving. We meditate with samadhi. If you delight in meditative states in solitude, don't hurt us, but dwell as we dwell. Right? So he's looking at them, and actually, isn't that an interesting moment there? I just want to pause and reflect on this, right? One is he plays with this beautiful metaphor, right, of that the folds in his clothes are like they're a hermitage for them. for the lice eggs, right? And then lice, because they're eggs, they don't move, right? These little eggs. And actually, he's identifying with them at that point, though, isn't he? In a deeper way. He's saying, I want to meditate deeply without moving, in an unmoving way. And he looks at them, and actually you can see it. He looks at them kind of in the folds of these lice eggs in the folds of his robes, right? And what he feels is they're like me, right? I'm them and they're me. And I want to, and I want to dwell unmoving in samadhi. He knows they're not literally in samadhi, of course, but he's saying, let me take that as a metaphor, right? And that they're sentient creatures, and I'm a sentient creature. And let me go off and learn from them, not kill them, but actually learn from them and meditate. Here I want to pause and just share something briefly, like a slide. When I read this poem the first time, it made me remember a story about one of my lamas, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. And actually the story was told by his attendant, Roger Kunsang, a monk, Roger Kunsang, who takes care of Lama Zopa. And the story Roger told, which was similar, he said, like, Lama Zopa was doing, I don't know what he was doing. He was in a monastery somewhere, and Roger would come in. And Roger said he came in and he found that Lama Zopa's robes had all these big holes in it. And so he thought, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Like, my guru has robes, So he immediately went out and got new robes and brought them back. And he replaced, he sort of took, like, he gave the new robes, let's put it that way. But then he came back and then found that now the old robes and the new robes had big holes in it. And so he was going like, do I go and buy more robes? What's going on? And he started looking around, and what he found was that there were, I believe it was lice. And so what Lama Zopa was doing, like this, it was like Shar Keldan Gyatso, is whenever he found like a section with lice or lice eggs, he would cut that section out like a big circle, and then he would like put it someplace safe in the room so that they could live in peace. And then he was like putting things near them that they could eat or something like that. And he was taking care of them. And so the more that there came, the more he would just cut out, and like he had like what's it called? Like almost like a sanctuary for lice there that he was sort of looking after. And I was like, oh wow, he had done what when I read this poem, I was like, oh, Lama Zopa had done what Shar Keldan Gyatso did. He saw in these lice and lice eggs sentient beings to be looked after. And I thought, who else does that? Right? Actually, I'll share one other story I'm pausing, but I'm going to share one other brief story this poem made me think of. This was a Dharma teaching I got. I remember I was actually in Connecticut when I was at undergraduate at Wesleyan University. I did my undergrad there, and Jan Willis was my professor. He's a Buddhism professor, wonderful teacher, wonderful person, author, and so on. Anyway, one day we had a small seminar in a room, and I was sitting close to her, and it was, I guess it must have been late spring or early, like the end of the year, the end of the school year, May probably. And she was lecturing, in this seminar. It was like around the table. And I remember this moment where she's lecturing and she had her watch out in front of her, the way professors sometimes do, so she doesn't have to keep doing this, so she could see the time. And I'm listening to her lecture, and I watch a mosquito land on her. And she continues lecturing, but without thinking. She wasn't thinking at all, but she picked up the watch and very gently tapped. She kept like tapping the mosquito until it left her arm. And then she just kept going. And at that point, I was, I guess, in my 20s, early 20s. And I thought, I remember I was just shocked because I'd never yet met anyone who wouldn't have immediately done this. As soon as a mosquito landed on their arm, everybody I'd known up to that moment in my life would have gone, and the mosquito would have been dead. But she gently nudged it. And for me, that was I don't remember what she was talking about, but that was the teaching I remember, was that had become so ingrained in her, nonviolence, right? That she just tapped it. And my point is like, she had done the work that Shar Keldan Gyatso is doing here, right? So that she didn't want to kill a mosquito. Anyway, let's keep going. Okay. So anyway, so the lice are telling him to dwell in samadhi and go and retreat, just like as they are in the folds of his robe. So they said. Then I said this to the lice, the fleas, and the lice eggs. And so now Shar Keldan Gyatso's voice comes back. You stupid, dumb insects. I am a human being, a monk of noble rank. From among insects, you are the bottom rung. For you to give me advice, ha, ridiculous. So again, like, but I mean, for Shar Keldan Gyatso to put himself in that role is very humble, first of all, isn't it? So he's actually very playful and humble. But also he's getting at something, isn't it? Because actually, as I read that one, the first time I read it, I thought that's pretty funny, and he's being humble. But then when I read it more, I was like, oh, actually, that's interesting. Like, I'm nobody of great rank, and I'm no monk or something like that, but actually, I would like that they're the insects of the bottom rung. I was like, oh, I would feel that. Like among all the insects, right? It's like, oh, lice. I think they're like, I don't know, like even ants, you can go, well, they're just like, it's just an ant, but like, or a bee or something, but like lice seem like the worst of the lowest rung of insects. I was like, oh, he's getting at a feeling that human beings have, right? Human beings look at fleas and lice like, oh, they're like, whereas if you're outside and you see, I don't know, actually, like it's true, isn't it? If you see like a ladybug, you go, oh, it's an insect, but it's kind of cute, or if you see a moth or something, right? Flitting around, you go, oh, it's pretty. But nobody does that for a flea or a louse or lice, lice eggs, right? So he's getting at a point there, right? Which is, this is what he's addressing the real feelings we would have, right? He's not sugarcoating them. And also our arrogance, isn't it? That we feel, like, what are they doing? Actually, like I don't kill insects in my house, but there are moments when if I see an insect that looks unpleasant in my house, my very first thought is, what's that doing here? This is my house. Like even now, that's still the first feeling that comes. Then I think, oh, it's an insect. I'm not going to kill it. I'll catch it or whatever. I'll take it outside if the weather's okay or something. But that's not the first thought. The first thought is something more like this. I'm a human being. This is my house. What are you doing here? And so he's admitting that, again, which is what he's implying is that's what we should do as Buddhist practitioners, is look at what do we really feel, then address it. Okay. So he says, because I said this, the lice, the fleas, and the lice eggs all fell on me and discoursed as thus. So now they're all joining together. The first time they were each speaking separately, now they're all going to join together. And they say, if even we lice, fleas, and lice eggs act under the power of Dharma, we embrace lamas and religious lords on down and old beggars on up. They treat everybody you see the point there? They treat everybody equally. He doesn't, right? He's saying, I'm a monk and a human being. I'm better than you. You're just the lowest insects. They're saying, hey, wait a second. We may be low the insects, but we treat, whether you're a king or a beggar or a famous lama, we lice will treat everybody the same. We're better, we're doing better than you at equanimity. You say you meditate on equanimity, we have better equanimity. Pretty good, isn't it? Then they say, although we act under the power of the world of convention, as for those such as high kings, nobles, noble ladies, ministers, subjects, rich people, heroes, and people with power, there is none that we do not eat or drink. Right? So they're saying we don't care about status. An association of lice from our group here, who are black and very hot-mouthed, call you a wealth of rich food. Because you have eaten dead food, killed food, right? And funeral repasts for so long. Funeral repast means like sometimes the monks are given if they do prayers for the dead, they're given offerings, right? So they're saying of him, what do you eat? First of all, you eat meat, right? Dead animals. And then also you eat the offerings on behalf of the dead. So they say to him, because you eat those things, it's only natural for us, for you to be eaten by us. We fleas who live here don't eat siddhas, the great yogis, who live on the peaks of mountains. Right? So they're saying if you were some great siddha who were actually in a cave, well, we wouldn't come up that high and we wouldn't eat you. But you're down here eating meat and doing village rituals. So of course we're going to eat you. They say, you say doing village rites is food for my mouth. Soar and be. Also listen, old monk, listen. Don't eat dead food or funeral repasts, and us black lice won't eat you. Don't rove about the towns, but go up to the mountain hermitage. isolated, pleasant, on top of green grass in a solitary and pleasant place, you will dwell in happiness, and the fleas as a group will be committed to never bothering you. Again, focus the whole of your ear for a moment. Don't look at other people, look at yourself. Looking at others is simply pursuing your own benefit. Pause there. What are they saying? I mean, I could keep going, but it's a long section here. Right? They're saying a few interesting things here, right? One is, what is the karma for us to be eating you? You eat animals, right? And you take offerings from people to do prayers, on behalf of the dead, but you're not always so sincere, and that's not a good use of your time, right? They're saying, go get enlightened, and then here they're saying something slightly, they're saying something more, right? Which is the focus of the whole of your ear for a moment. Listen well, they're saying, right? And then they say this point, don't look at other people, look at yourself. Looking at others is simply pursuing your own benefit. So what they're saying there is like, don't judge other people, look at yourself honestly, right? And you see, that's what Shar Keldan Gyatso is doing here, isn't it? And I just want to say that's really, that's a core Buddhist point. But it's also one that just for myself, I've been lately I find that useful because it's easy, anytime it's easy to look at others, right? But particularly in these times, right? I've been noticing that, like for myself, it's easy to look at other people, right? Like, oh, this person's not, whatever, well, first of all, with the political situation, it's easy to be judgmental of others. Then with the political situation as it's sort of gotten confused or combined or whatever with the virus, right? It's easy also to be judgmental of other people and look at other people. And what Shar Keldan Gyatso is giving here as pith advice, that's just Buddhist pith advice, is don't look at other people, look at yourself. Looking at others is simply pursuing your own benefit, right? It's self-aggrandizing. When you're judging others, you're promoting your own self, your own ego in a way. And they're saying, look at yourself honestly, which is what this poem's about, isn't it? Really, this poem's, it's about karma, it's about enlightenment, it's about going to retreat, but it's also about looking at yourself honestly. So then he says, they say, right, the chorus of fleas, lice, and lice say, by breaking away from benefiting yourself and by benefiting the Dharma and sentient beings, when you die, you will not be eaten by beguiling evil spirits. Right? So they're saying, stop the self-aggrandizing, stop the self-promotion. And again, in this case, Shar Keldan Gyatso would put himself in that role, saying, right, oh, I'm a monk, how could you? But what he's getting at is we need to look at that, right? Whether I'm judging the insect that's walking across my room and saying, what are you doing in here? Or whether I'm looking at somebody who, I had that very much. I was in a building, last time I went into my office and I bumped into somebody in the hall. I was going into the stairway and somebody wasn't wearing a mask and they were inside. And my first reaction was not going to move away from them. But then I had this whole judgment that came, spontaneous, right? Oh, they're not, what are they thinking? And they're not and then I was like, and then afterwards I thought, I got home later and I was still thinking about that. It was in my mind. Why would they be in the building? They, the CDC said this. And then I realized like, wow, I don't know that. I don't know what that person's thinking, but they probably forgot about me. I was just some weird guy who walked away from them. But I'm still, ruminating about them. And my point is like, that's what he's getting at. That's not benefiting others. It's not benefiting yourself. It's a self-aggrandizing, egocentric rumination. Let it go and fix yourself. Right, work on and that's what I needed to do, is fix my own mind in that case, right? Because it wasn't doing anybody any good, me sitting in my house thinking about why that person, And then I had to pause and say, I don't know why they weren't. What do I know? I don't know them, right? But anyway, so they're teaching Mahayana. Is my point, right? Now they're clearly teaching bodhicitta, aren't they? So he says, now they continue. Just as each and every one of us, lice, fleas, and lice eggs, has the same idea, namely that it is not necessary to talk to you who eat meat and drink blood. So you old monks who have renounced this life through the teaching, but who practice the holy Dharma while thinking about this life, you must not talk to us. Go be harmonious with everyone. Don't be despondent because you have no entourage. Strive to become completely enlightened. And when you achieve enlightenment, we will also be your retinue. Moreover, listen, when you are sitting in meditation and we bite you, recall your karma of past lives. And being liberated from sinful karma, you will exert yourself in realizing good karma. Right? So now they're saying, take our bites as teachings, first of all, right? And they're making a very profound point here. Remember earlier they said, if you ate us, now we're eating you. If you kill us, then forever we'll be related. They're making a point, right? We're all infinitely interdependent and interrelated, right? And and they're saying, they said earlier, if you're violent to us, you'll continue a process of limitless violence, right? And limitless aggression, which is what samsara is, right? And here they're saying, on the other hand, right, if you let go of your egocentrism, right, if you take our bites as teachings to not create bad karma, but to create good karma, then here I think is a really important line where they said, strive to become completely enlightened. And when you achieve enlightenment, we will also be your retinue, right? So they're saying now is the moment where you can create a different karmic relationship. And if you develop bodhicitta in relation to us, right, as we bite you, in this case. And if you meditate, then when you become a Buddha, we'll be your disciples, right? And you can imagine that. That's what they're saying, right? Like that they'll become, that they're creating an interdependent relationship, and that these are who will be his disciples, right? And part of that is that's what bodhicitta is about, isn't it? Is we change our karmic relationship to others. And so he's making, they're telling him that, but he's also making that point to us, right? That if we relate, just think about that, right? Each person or each sentient being, each insect, each animal, each whatever that you relate, that I relate to, that you relate to, if we relate to them egocentrically, then we're creating a cycle of tension or conflict or difficulty or interpersonal problems, right? On the other hand, if we start now in any given moment to relate to others through bodhicitta, the result of that will be, right, that eventually bodhicitta leads to, for us, actually it's an interesting point, for us, if you develop bodhicitta, it leads you to enlightenment, right? But what does it do relationally? And that's what Shar Keldan Gyatso and the fleas and lice eggs are pointing out here, is it creates a relationship where eventually you'll help those beings. If you can help them now, you will, but if you can't, or to whatever extent, but eventually you'll lead them to enlightenment, right? And if you read the stories of the Mahayana Sutras, that's how it works, right? Like when the Buddha interacts with somebody, oftentimes he says, in a past life, how did this come about? When a past life, when I was generating bodhicitta, I came across this being and this happened and that happened. So that's how it works, right? So, actually, I'll share one other point about that. I'm thinking of Lama Zopa Rinpoche. He has some property up in Washington, in a very rural part of Washington State for retreat. He's not there hardly ever, but other people are there. It's his property, but somebody offered it to him, and now people go there and do retreat, live there, mostly monks and nuns. And I know one of the monks. He's a wonderful guy. And anyway, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, I guess, asked him if he'd be willing to bring offerings, I don't know, it was every day or every few days, to the anthills, and to say mantra and to chant mantras to them. And so this monk, that's part of what his routine is he brings food to the anthills on the property, and he chants sutras or mantras, and you clearly have the sense those are that monk's future disciple. When that monk's a Buddha, those he's gonna have a lot of disciples, because there are a lot of ants in an anthill, aren't there? But it's a practice of love, isn't it? It's a practice of compassion, and compassion for the least. Part of what's very touching, I think, about this poem, and also about that monk doing that, is the same thing. It's compassion and love for the least powerful, right? Ants are not. They can't do anything for you, right? He's not doing it because he's going to be. Actually, and if he tells I'm praising him right now, but for the most part, if you tell anybody in America, oh, what do you do for, what's your career? Oh, I bring offerings and sing to ants. They'll think, oh, you should be in a psychiatric hospital or something, right? They would think you're, or at worst, at best, they might think you're a loser, right? But actually, it's the practice of a bodhisattva, isn't it? And the same thing, right? Like, in other words, the idea of Lama Zopa with the cutout robes and the, sanctuary of lice, right? But that's the Mahayana Buddhism. Compassion for all beings, right? Even in lice, even fleas. If fleas are left out, that's the profundity here, I think, of Shar Keldan Gyatso's poem. That's implied here, right? In these lines. If you don't have bodhicitta, if your bodhicitta doesn't include fleas, it's not bodhicitta, actually. Right? Bodhicitta means it includes the fleas. It includes the lice. So now he says, based on what the insects had said to me, I decided to go meditate. And I said these words: because I have entered the blessings of a holy Lama, lice, fleas, and lice eggs have expounded the Dharma. Because the Dharma is deep, I have turned my mind into it. In order to practice Dharma, I will go to a solitary place. Right? So now he's saying, yeah, I'm convinced. You guys, because of my Lama, I was able to hear your teaching, and you guys have convinced me. You all have convinced me. So now, because I had said that, the insects said this: without sending what you have explained into the wind, go practice for the benefit of your own thoughts. It is not sufficient to know about Dharma. You have to practice it. Now, in order to practice it, go to a solitary place. Thus they discoursed. And that's the ending of that poem. Right? So he takes their advice and he decides to go into retreat. And I'll just say one last comment on that. One is, I hope you get a sense of him in this poem. But one last point here is this idea, right, that this idea where he says, Shar Keldan Gyatso said, because I've entered the blessings of a holy Lama, lice, fleas, and lice eggs have expounded the Dharma. I want to point out something just for us that I think is implied there, which is profound, right? Which is, if you've met a Lama, if you've met the Dharma, right, as we all have, then all circumstances can become teachings of the Dharma, right? That's also what he's saying there, right? When he says, because of my Lama, these lice, fleas, and lice eggs have expounded the Dharma to me, right? He's also implying something for us, right? Which is, and it's what his teacher, the Panchalama, was getting at with the debate between ignorance and wisdom. It's what Shar Keldan Gyatso is getting at in this poem. But what is he saying? He's saying, this is the process for all of us. Does that make sense? In other words, it's not enough. We've heard some teachings from great lamas, like, the Dalai Lama or Gyumed Khensur Rinpoche or Geshe Darge and so on, right? We can hear teachings from lamas, but then we have to do this process that he just did, right? So when something comes up, right, like annoyance, agitation, pride, anger, whatever, whatever the emotion is, he's saying we have to now do this process, right? We have to look at honestly at our own, right? He said it very clearly, right? Don't look at other people, look at yourself, right? So he's saying here, we have to look at our own actual thoughts and feelings, right? Honestly. And then we have to be present to them. And then we have to engage them with the Dharma. Does that make sense? So you see the flea jump up and go down, and you think, oh, wait, I can go up, I can go down. I can go up and then down, or I can keep going up because I have the method. Which am I going to do, right? And which am I going to do in relation to this flea? Which am I going to do and I'll share one other point that I think is very profound, which is Lama Tsongkhapa, I think it's related to what we're talking about, but Lama Tsongkhapa in his middle-length Lamrim, he makes this really profound point where he says, if you just go off and you meditate on love for all beings, and you think, I love all beings, I love all beings, I love all beings, something like that, he says, it'll seem very pleasant at the time, and not much good is going to come of that. He says, later on, when you examine your mind, you won't have much love. And then he says, on the other hand, if when you come across an individual being, whether it be, and he doesn't say this, but whether it be a flea or a lice egg or a person, if you meditate on love for them, for that flea, for that person, for that dog, for that whatever, scorpion, whatever it would be, right? He says, if you meditate on love for each individual you come across and do it deeply in the way Shar Keldan Gyatso is here, Tsongkhapa says, then later, when you examine your mind, you'll find that you have universal love and universal compassion. And he says, so the way to develop universal compassion is not to say, let me have universal compassion. It's to say, my goal is universal compassion, but let me engage in meditation on compassion for each individual. And he says, and you have to include beings, friends, enemies, and strangers among those individuals. Go out of your way to think of people you don't care about and meditate on for them. And he says, and if you pick individuals you don't care about, this individual you don't care about, that individual you don't care about, this other one who you don't care about, then eventually you'll find that you have love for all individuals you didn't previously care about. Whereas if you just say, oh, I care about everybody I don't care about, you're lying to yourself in a way, is what he's getting at. So I think Shar Keldan Gyatso here is giving this very profound sort of teaching on how to do that. Any questions or comments or anything about that poem? Because that's the end of that poem, or I can go on to a different one, but I just want to pause because we finished that one.
Oh, I just had a quick question. Sorry. I was wondering, when you were speaking about the Mahamudra, when we were talking about the fleas and going up and soaring into the light, could you expand on, I don't know enough about Mahamudra to understand. I know it's not something you can go into fully.
Sure. No, that's a great question. Like, actually, I'll look for who was the, pull it back up. The actual line, I'll just go back to that and I'll use that as the basis for it. But what he says here is the fleas say, I love that. I enjoy saying that, don't I? The fleas say, it's fun. The fleas say, the nature of your mind will soar in the expanse of the sky. Don't threaten us, float up like us, right? That's the actual line. And he has many Shar Keldan Gyatso, many of his poems are actually exclusively about Mahamudra, really. But the idea there is this, I'll pause. So what he says is soar in the expanse of the sky. That's, first of all, that's a common image related to Mahamudra. But the way his teacher, the Panchalama, who wrote the most famous commentary on Gelugpa commentary rather on Mahamudra, frames it is this: so he frames it this way. Actually, he says ultimately Mahamudra meditation is a meditation on emptiness, but then in particular the Mahamudra tradition, you meditate on the emptiness of the mind itself. Because all objects are, as the Heart Sutra says, right? The Heart Sutra lists all different objects, right? Form is empty, emptiness is form. Also, so feelings, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors are empty, consciousness is empty, and then it goes on, right? Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, and so on. So you can meditate on the emptiness of anything, right? And oftentimes when you listen to Tibetan lamas, they'll often use the example of a vase, won't they? Like they'll say the vase or the cup or, a pillar. There are certain traditional ones, but in the Mahamudra tradition, it's the mind itself that you meditate. That's the object, and then you meditate on the emptiness of the mind. So the way the Panchalama in his Mahamudra text teaches it is, first you meditate on the conventional nature of mind in order to develop calm abiding or meditative concentration. And so he teaches that so that you identify the conventional nature of mind, which is clear in the sense of unobstructed, and that's why it's like the sky. They often use this idea of like the sky. So it's clear in the sense of unobstructed, and it's aware, or it's knowing, it's an awareness. So it's not because the space itself is clear, but consciousness also has an awareness or a knowing aspect, right? And so in the Mahamudra tradition, you first sort of you identify that in your own experience, and then you practice your meditative concentration on that, right? So when you think about meditative concentration, you choose an object of meditation, right? Sometimes it's a visualization of the Buddha, or sometimes it's your breath, as we did for just a couple minutes at the beginning, or, there are all different objects of meditation, right, that you could use to develop concentration. But in the Mahamudra tradition, the object that you focus on is the nature of mind itself. And in the way the Panchalama teaches it, you start with the conventional nature of mind. So when he says So it's space-like in that sense, space-like awareness. And then the Panchalama teaches this beautiful, has a number of beautiful descriptions, but one is where he says, once you develop concentration on that, he says, he has this beautiful metaphor in his text where he says there comes a point where it's like a tranquil lake. You know, like imagine like, I remember once when I was a teenager, my grandfather took me, I went to the Canadian Rockies. I remember once I got up very early in the morning and I was like, we were in the mountains and we saw this like totally lake that was like a mirror, you know. And so Panchalama says, eventually your mind becomes like that, right? Where it's sort of totally tranquil. And you're meditating in this kind of way on the clear, knowing mind. And then he says, and then like a tiny fish that can move under the lake, under that crystalline lake without causing even the slightest ripple. He says, like that, you stay in that tranquil state, and then you analyze the emptiness of the mind. You analyze that the mind, you do an analytical meditation in that very subtle way, like the tiny fish under the crystalline lake. He says you analyze the mind to realize its emptiness, that it lacks, that even the mind lacks any intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature. And then you realize and meditate on the emptiness of mind. And I think that where he says here, soar, soar into the expanse, that's ultimately that. You know, the real Mahamudra is that. It's when you can realize the emptiness of mind itself, and that becomes, and what he said, then he says, float up and up, float up endlessly. In other words, that's the realization of emptiness in Mahamudra that leads to full enlightenment, if it's under the influence of bodhicitta. So when he says the nature of your mind, he ultimately means the ultimate nature of your mind. But first you have to kind of know the conventional nature of mind and sort of identify the mind. Then you can meditate on its emptiness, and that's the essence of Mahamudra, when you realize the emptiness of the mind itself. And then it looked like there was oh, do you have more?
No, I was going to say thank you.
Okay, good. And then there was something else about, here in the chat, somebody put a question. Let's see. Okay. Then is Shar Keldan Gyatso just a monk? The painting depicted the signs of a Buddha. Yeah, no, so the idea is that he was, he was recognized as having become enlightened in his lifetime, kind of like Milarepa. So he was, in the Tibetan tradition, he would have been, his students for sure would have considered him to be an enlightened being. But I think that the image of sort of the signs of a Buddha, it's not that he literally had them historically. I think the idea would be that those were a sign of respect from his students. That and sometimes you see that in sort of iconography, that the and part of that is like in the Lamrim, right? The Guru Yoga, that you think of your teacher as the Buddha. And so sometimes in iconography, especially after someone has passed away, they sort of, they'll idealize the imagery of the person. So I think that's what that would be. So it wasn't that he literally kind of looked like that, but he probably looked like the Tanka. I think that was probably, my guess is that's kind of what he looked like. I think that was made in his lifetime. But the iconography of him kind of being a Buddha, that would be more an expression of the devotion of his disciples. And then there was a comment also from Richard. Yeah, I agree. I guess I think everybody can everybody see that comment? Yeah, yes, I won't read it aloud. Yeah, and I agree. Like, in other words, but I guess one thing I'll say is, like, you get the sense. We'll say, which is on the one hand, I think our culture is much more extreme. I agree with you in that way. But you get the sense, I get like let's say this right, like, I don't know how to say it even the right way. Like, I guess I'll just say, like, it is me to do respect. No, I agree with what you said. I guess I'll just say, like, respect. I agree. I think that I'll just say a couple points. Like, one is even ultimately, of course, the Dharma. Well, 2 points I'll say. One is the Dharma is the Dharma, and the real essence is love and compassion and karma, right? The teachings on karma, and those apply. So one point is, like, it's very tricky though in one way, right? Like, because in one sense, even if we're in a culture, it's tricky, isn't it? You can be in a culture where, and actually, but if you think about it, actually, Tibet under, at that time, at the time of Shar Keldan Gyatso, the culture he was in wasn't entirely, he often laments that. If you read some of his other poems, he laments this. He says, he was living not in central Tibet, but in Amdo, which was a fairly remote region at that point, and people weren't very in accord with Dharma. He sort of laments that. And then he says, and not only that, we're occupied. And the Mongolian army was an army. They were ready to fight. So I guess one point is, like, there's, the tensions of his culture and the tensions of ours are very different. And his culture was certainly more in accordance with the Dharma than ours is. For sure, Tibetan culture was by his time. But there's always I guess one point I'm making is there's always a tension between, like, the pressures of a culture and then our own need, our own Dharma in a way. And one point is, like, it's tricky, isn't it? Because karma applies regardless. It's not like you get a pass because you're in a culture where it's not, if the culture says kill somebody, even a person, let's say the culture says you should kill people, that doesn't give you an out on your own karma, right, is one point. And we know that, actually. I was actually just reading a book by, a very beautiful book by, Joan Halifax, Roshi Joan Halifax, a Zen teacher. And she was pointing out, she was saying, like, she wasn't talking about karma, but she was making the same point. She was working, at one point in the book, she was describing working with, like, soldiers, who had killed in a sanctioned way, and a number of them who never were okay again, and sort of the fact that they hadn't done something illegal, that they had been following orders, that they were sort of she was sort of describing her real people, and she was sort of saying, I mean, they did what they were ordered to do, and there was nothing sort of, they were not, what's the word? They would have been considered maybe heroes or something by some people. But she was saying in their, the damage to their own conscience wasn't something they could get past, the number of people she knew. So she was describing that. And I guess what I'm getting at is, like, deep in our being, we know, right? Like for us as individuals. And so one point is we have to follow that. And I'll share one other, just a story, a reflection, which is, I remember one of my teachers was Rinpoche Rinpoche, who was a very delightful, amazing person. And he and Khensur Rinpoche were close to each other. And I met Khensur Rinpoche through him. And I think he was the one who invited Khensur Rinpoche to come to the US, which is how Khensur Rinpoche ended up teaching all around. But anyway, Rinpoche used to say, sometimes he would say, he was very funny. He would say, if you practice Dharma really, then people will think you're nuts. And then he said, but we who practice Dharma also think they're nuts. So it's okay. We're all, it's all right. We all think each other's nuts, no problem. And he would sort of laugh then. And he was just making this point, so I get it. On the one hand, each of us has to discern for ourselves in terms of our actual lived experience, how are we going to live? And that's what Shar Keldan Gyatso is doing here. For him, the answer was go off to retreat, right? So actually, he wasn't going to stay around. His agreement with the fleas was if he went off to retreat, they would leave him alone, right? So I guess that was the plan, but I guess my point is we each have to discern for ourselves how to live, right? Not everybody was going to go off and live in high mountain retreats like Shar Keldan Gyatso decides to at the end of the poem, but that was what he wanted to do. But I guess my point is just, like, we each have to discern for ourselves how we're going to live, but we have to do it as Shar Keldan Gyatso is doing here. I think the essence of this is that we have to be honest with ourselves, honest about karma, relate our own life decisions and experiences to the teachings, and come to our own wisdom and our own discernment about what to do. I mean, like, it doesn't mean we're all going to go off, obviously, to the Himalayas or something like that. But But the essence is, I think, the honesty and the dialogue, right? To honestly dialogue our own decisions in relation to the Dharma in the way he does, and not deceive ourselves and come to the best conclusion we can. And it's not always easy, is it? I think it's often, it's often very hard to do. You know, I think so, but I think the danger to me anyway is when we either don't face honestly what we're feeling. That's a danger because it's not, then we're not being honest with ourselves, or when we sort of bypass it. You know, we do that sort of thing where we sort of, I don't know, like I do that sometimes, I know, or I pretend like I don't really face like, wow, this is what I'm feeling. This is a hard decision. What's the Dharma really say? What are the implications? And sort of really be with it, but just sort of go, you know, I don't know, like try to convince myself that I'm some good Buddhist or something like that, or whatever it would be, you know, or sort of, and also that he's alone when he's doing this, right? You get the sense that he's sitting alone in his room doing it, right? He's not doing it to impress somebody else or to, right? He's like, you know, he's looking at the fleas and the lice and really having a dialogue with them, you know, and I think that's what we have to do, the equivalent of that with whatever decision we make. So it's hard, you know, and like I agree with what Richard said. It's hard, you know, there are cultural factors, there are other people pressures, and I mentioned just Rinpoche's point because it's like, you know, that what Shar Keldan Gyatso is getting at is the same thing, which is ultimately we're responsible for ourselves, though, and we have to make our own decisions. And it's hard to do sometimes. That's all. I don't know more than that, really.
Oh, just a quick question. Which book was this poem from?
Oh, sorry. That poem was in the Tibetan Songs of Realization by Victoria Sujata. Yeah, and so I should say it again. So that's the older of the two books, Tibetan Songs of Realization. It's a little hard to get. I had to sort of order it from some, I don't remember where I got it from. This one's not on Amazon or something. It was a little difficult to get it. But, and I think it's published, well, it's published by Brill. So. But yeah, Tibetan Songs of Realization, Victoria Sujata. And then the more recent one, which is a little easier to get, but I don't think it has, I'm not sure if it has that poem in it, but is a Journey to Distant Groves, also by Victoria Sujata. Journey to Distant Groves, Profound Songs of a Tibetan Siddha, Keldan Gyatso, of the Tibetan Siddha, Keldan Gyatso. Yeah, that book is kind of just this. The Tibetan Songs of Realization talks about the meter and a little more about his biography and so on. Whereas Journey to Distant Groves is mostly just his poems, and it has it's kind of interspersed, which kind of captures the essence of him, I think, in some way, or not the essence, but like some feeling of him. It's interspersed with some nice pictures from the Himalayas, because he was that kind of, you know, he was that kind of person who liked to wander around the Himalayas. But were there other questions?
I have a brief question.
Oh, sure.
I was just wondering if you might be able to give us a good resource for the Mahamudra meditation practice described that's as clear as the meditation itself. Thank you.
Oh, sure. No, let's see. I mean, there are like I'll say so. For the, I guess I'll say this way. Like there are a lot of books in English now about Mahamudra, and from a practical, like from a practice perspective, I think my favorite book in English, I'll put it that way, is there's a commentary by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, translated by Alexander Berzin. And it's, actually I have it here, it's called The Kagu Tradition of Mahamudra. So that's it. It's called, yeah, The Kagu Tradition of Mahamudra. And it contains a translation of the root text by the first Panchalama, which is a beautiful, brief root text. You know, and I'll say comment about that. So like that, the Mahamudra tradition of the Gelugpa is actually, was an oral tradition actually. so it was something that they say Tsongkhapa taught to, to a very small number of disciples, but never wrote about. And then it was passed down from disciple to disciple orally until the time of the first Panchalama. And then actually, I'll share. Oops. Let's see if I can find the root text in here. Oh, there it is, 97. And then, so then the first Panchalama Losang Gyaltsen wrote a root text where he decided it was time to put it in writing. And he actually says something about that. I won't find it too quickly, but in brief, he kind of says in there, he says now the time, he kind of says that it was somehow the time was right and he was the right person to do it. And so he writes it down. And so this text includes the root text, but includes it's based on two commentaries to that root text by the Dalai Lama. So the Gelugpa Mahasiddha. Then I think it was in the last 2 years or so, a new book came out. So if you're really interested in it, it's a great resource. And I have it over there, so I'm looking. It's called Mind Seeing Mind. And it's by Roger Jackson. And it's probably the most comprehensive. He covers like the Kagu, briefly, he kind of goes over the Kagu history of Mahamudra and the Kagu tradition. And then he really, his emphasis is the Gelugpa Mahamudra tradition. But he translates the root text by the Panchalama and his auto commentary to it. So that's in there also. And then he translates numerous other texts. He has a whole bunch of translations. So he gives a history and he talks a little bit about Shar Keldan Gyatso as an important author and figure in the Mahamudra tradition and the Gelugpa tradition. So that's another great resource. So those would be the two best, right? If you're interested in the Gelugpa tradition, those are the two best. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating topic, Mahamudra, a great, meditation technique. And it's one other thing I'll say I didn't mention earlier, but I should have, is also the Mahamudra practice also is very much, it's very related to Guru Yoga. So it's the idea, because it's like this oral tradition, and it's very connected to the idea that you realize Mahamudra through practice. It's a practice tradition, but it's also like through the experience of the connection to your guru. That it's very much a kind of lineage that comes from, and Gyumed Khensur Rinpoche has taught Mahamudra. He taught it in DC, he taught it in New York, and he taught it in California. I don't know if he's taught it other places too, but he's a master of the Mahamudra. So he teaches that. And there are recordings also of his teachings that exist. I know, because I listened to, I was there for the ones in DC and California, but the ones in New York I missed, but I listened to the recordings, so I know they exist. And you can probably get them. So if you really want to learn that, the best thing is to hear Khensur Rinpoche teach it, because it's like, you can read it, but then to hear him, because he's actually.
That sounds like a great combination. Thank you.
Yeah. His teachings are wonderful on Mahamudra. And I'll share, maybe I'll just, as we're almost out of time, I'll share also, like, in the poems of Shar Keldan Gyatso also, he really, he a lot of his poems, he has a number of poems like this one that are sort of these dialogues where there's some that are very fun also, like kind of like the Panchalama, where he kind of says, like, he'll sort of look at himself and he'll say, like, pride, you've really, you seem to be very strong. Humility, where have you show, what happened to you? And anger, you're like this. Love, you seem to be taking a nap, and so on. Like, he really kind of engages himself in this way, which I find that for somebody at my level of practice, I find those particularly helpful, because it's this practice of being honest with yourself and really looking and relating to Dharma. He also has some beautiful poems, though, about like being in mountain retreat, and sort of where he'll use this natural imagery, not just of the sky, of course, which is often an image for Mahamudra, but of the Tibetan mountains and plants and animals, and because he spent a lot of time in nature, of course, being a yogi. And then in many of those, he'll talk about Mahamudra itself, and he'll kind of give practice instructions on Mahamudra. And you really get the sense of somebody who, just went off and practiced and did that, and And the other thing you'll find in his poetry also is, he also did a lot of tantric practice, Vajrayana practice, and you find, and he doesn't write a huge amount about that, but he mentions it, and there's also, because I guess I mentioned that because if you're interested in Mahamudra, the Panchalama way of presenting it is there's a version of Mahamudra, the one I shared, is in accordance with the sutras, you could say, or Sutra Mahamudra, they call it sometimes. And then there's a uniquely tantric version of Mahamudra, but that's an extremely advanced practice that I think Shar Keldan Gyatso was a master of, but that you have to first have practiced the generation stage of Tantra and then practice the completion stage. It's a completion stage practice of Tantra, so it's a very advanced practice. So most of us, it's fascinating to learn about, but it's not something we can yet experientially practice.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to say it's also very nice because on the whole, Buddhism is quite serious, and it's kind of nice that this is kind of jovial, the life and everything. Because sometimes I feel get too heavy in the Buddhism, and this kind of lightens it a bit, especially when you're home alone all the time now.
Yeah.
This is good.
He has a few poems like that. He has another one where the bees talk to him. That's very fun, where the bees provide a spontaneous teaching, and again, and the bees also kind of tease him a bit, and so I mean, he has he's very earthy and playful, and that's part of what I like. I found it useful. That's why I've kept his poems throughout the pandemic right near where I meditate, partly for that reason. It's like, it's sometimes been a heavy year, and it's nice to read some poems that are inspiring but not
Is the Panchalama's book that playful? The one that you mentioned, the debate between ignorance and...
His book, the debate between, this translator calls it the reifying habit, but it's ignorance. The Panchalama's book, my experience of it is there are sections of it in the early part that I find really quite funny, actually, and I think they are. And actually, I'll share this, actually, at the very beginning, he considered the Panchalama, I mean, his main text is the root text of the Gelugpa Mahasiddha, but he begins his debate between wisdom and the reifying habit by saying, the essence of Mahamudra, including the profound basis, path, and result, can be identified in this way. So he frames it he begins it with a reference to Mahamudra. So he considers that. In my experience, the early part of the text is pretty funny, where they're each kind of teasing each other. And, as I said, ignorance sort of says to wisdom, nobody cares about you, you're boring, nobody wants, which very much I think our society, it's true also. And then there are points where wisdom says, to ignorance, the reifying habit, right, self-grasping, wisdom sort of, it gives these responses like, you think, like, it's like, where like wisdom, ignorance basically says, I've been around since beginningless time. Like, I'm very important, essentially, right? Like, and there are parts where, wisdom kind of says, you grasp something that doesn't even exist. Like, how can you, how can you be important? Like, you don't even, essentially, you don't even know anything, and you're not really, you're not really even, you're not truly existent even, essentially, so it becomes so it is quite playful. Later in that text, though, it becomes very philosophically detailed. And so that's why I paused. Is the early part of the text I find quite playful. The Dalai Lama says that he often, he quotes that text sometimes, and I've heard him say that text helped him understand emptiness when he was young. So it brings up eventually the Panchalama starts to bring up very philosophically detailed points, like the differences between different tenet systems, views of emptiness, as wisdom really gets very precise. So the latter parts, none of it, it's all beautiful and wonderful, but the latter parts become, I guess I would say, philosophically detailed, and maybe less playful, but still quite very profound, I guess. But it's noon, so I'm realizing we should stop. So sorry, we only got to one poem, but hopefully that's okay. I thought I might get to 2 or 3, but it was good. But I guess we should dedicate that, shouldn't we? So. The supreme jewel, bodhicitta, where it has not arisen, may it arise and grow. Where it has arisen, may it not decrease, but increase more and more. In the snowy mountain paradise, you the source of good and happiness, all-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. Well, thanks, everybody. It's fun to get together.
Yeah,
See
you should do this another class on this and do the other poems.
Oh, sure. Yeah, sometime we could do that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, because he has many wonderful poems.
Yeah, very nice.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lorne.
Thanks. Good to hear and see you guys.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
Thanks.